Welcome to this exploration of one of the most disturbing cases in Massachusetts history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. What locations and times of day or night these recorded stories reach are of interest to us. It was 1878. Boston had become America's hub for scientific and intellectual advancement. Horse-drawn carriages made their way through the winding alleyways. Gas lamps lit the cobblestone pathways, and the city hummed with the promise of contemporary thought. During this time, science and medicine started their uneasy dance with the secrets of the human mind. The lines between valid research and pseudoscience were still hazy, and in this gray area, some people felt free to investigate ideas that more reputable organizations were afraid to take on. A brief notification was published in the Boston Evening Transcript on December 3rd of that year. Simply put, it said, Dr. Elijah Worthington welcomes curious minds to witness demonstrations of mesmerism and its therapeutic applications. Beacon Hill Society Hall, Thursday evenings. What appeared to be a harmless invitation to observe scientific demonstration would turn into the first element in a tale of unfathomable horror that would plague the Back Bay district for many years. Archived attendance records from the Society Hall show that only 17 people attended the first demonstration, primarily doctors, academics, and a few society women who were known for their interest in progressive ideas. The notice reappeared the following week with the addition of a single line, private consultations available by appointment. The number of attendees doubled by the third week. Worthington apparently had a waiting list of weeks for his private practice, and by January 1879, he had relocated his demonstrations to the bigger Parker Memorial Hall to accommodate expanding audiences. On the 17th of February 1879, Dr. Worthington's disappearance was formally documented. The probe was inexplicably abandoned after exactly 3 weeks. The official report stated that there was not enough proof of foul play and that the departure was assumed to be voluntarily. However, a number of records found in 1965, while Massachusetts General Hospital was being renovated, reveal a quite different story, one that Boston's wealthy families have been working for generations to conceal. The communication between Detective James Sullivan, the investigating officer, and Dr. William Hammond, the hospital's main physician, was among the records discovered sealed in a wall hollow in what had been the administrator's office. In a letter dated March 2, 1879, Sullivan, the circumstances surrounding Dr. Worthington's absence suggest something beyond ordinary disappearance. The condition of his study, the accounts of his landlady, and particularly the effects on those who attended his final demonstration, point to a matter possibly beyond police jurisdiction. Records from that era indicate that Dr. Worthington had studied in Vienna and Paris, where he had picked up hypnosis and suggestion techniques from the most skilled practitioners of the time. His office on Commonwealth Avenue drew wealthy customers seeking relief from ailments that traditional medicine was unable to treat, and his treatments were reported to be remarkably effective, especially on patients suffering from what was then called nervous exhaustion or hysterical tendencies. According to the Massachusetts Medical Register, Worthington obtained his Ph.D. from Edinburgh University in 1865. He then undertook specialized training under Jean-Martin Charcot, a pioneer in neurological research at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris. Professor Holcroft's 1,927 investigations, however, turned up no evidence of Worthington attending Edinburgh during the alleged time frame, raising the possibility that he had falsified some of his academic credentials, a practice that was widespread among experts in what were then regarded as ancillary medical specialties. Worthington's belief that the captivated mind may visit regions beyond ordinary consciousness set him apart from his contemporaries. He kept meticulous diaries detailing tests in which people allegedly spoke languages they had never studied, remembered events they could not have experienced, and displayed knowledge that seemed impossible to naturally acquire. Partially preserved in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, these journals come to an abrupt halt in January 1879. In one notable entry from December 1878, Worthington described a session with a subject identified only as Mrs. L. writing, "Under deep trance today, Mrs. L. demonstrated remarkable abilities. When presented with a sealed envelope containing a text in Greek, she was able to recite its contents perfectly, despite having no knowledge of the language." More interestingly, when questioned about the source of this knowledge, she described borrowing it from an entity she perceived as observing our session from what she termed the adjacent space. Another entry from early January 1879 reads, "Subject exhibits increasing sensitivity with each session." Today, without prompting, she described in precise detail a surgical procedure performed at Mass General at exactly the same hour as our session, a procedure neither she nor I had knowledge of. When awakened, she retained no memory of this knowledge. I am increasingly convinced that the mesmerized mind can transcend not only the limitations of memory, but of space itself. Dr. Worthington's final known public demonstration was on the 11th of February, 1879. Newspaper reports state that during the demonstration, an unforeseen incident led to the apparent discomfort of several audience members, who then left. The Boston Globe only reported that Dr. Worthington was visibly shaken when he left, and that the event ended earlier than expected. He disappeared without a trace 6 days later. A little more information was given by the Boston Daily Advertiser, which stated that the subject seemed to go into a state of extreme agitation during the demonstration and spoke quickly in what some witnesses referred to as multiple voices layered upon one another. Dr. Worthington tried to calm the subject, but it didn't seem like he could break her out of the trance using his standard techniques. When the subject passed out and needed to be seen by a doctor in the crowd, the demonstration came to an end. In the 6 days that passed between the protest and Worthington's disappearance, what transpired? Dr. Worthington hardly left his study, according to Mrs. Sarah Peyton, the landlady of his rooms on Beacon Street. Despite the fact that no visitors were received, she claimed to hear continuous mumbling, as if in discussion. It started as a low vibration that seemed to pass through the walls themselves. Then it changed into something like speech, but layered, as though many people were speaking in perfect unison. Peyton explained in her statement to police that she was awakened the night before his disappearance by a sound unlike any I have heard before or since. Not quite a scream, but a sound no human throat should produce. I confess I was too frightened to leave my room to investigate. By morning, the sounds had stopped, and when I brought the doctor his customary breakfast tray, I found his rooms empty. Worthington's chambers and bed were discovered deserted the next morning. The state of his study, with papers piled in exact concentric circles on the floor and dark cloth covering every mirror in the flat, was the sole oddity. Police files preserved in the Boston City Archives document a number of peculiar aspects of the scene, including the one note that was discovered on his desk, which stated just, "It appears I was mistaken about who was influencing whom." The first officer to react to Peyton's report, Officer Michael Donovan, observed that there were no indications of forced entry or struggle in the room, despite the mess of documents. The odd marks on the inside of the doctor's closet door were especially noteworthy. They were a set of concentric circles with strange symbols positioned at regular intervals. Using what the police medic thought was India ink, these seemed to have been drawn with remarkable accuracy. Early police inquiries focused on potential romantic involvement or financial malfeasance, but both paths soon came to a standstill. Dr. Worthington had no known love relationships or enemies, and his accounts were all in order. Even though the inquiry might have gone on, the case was quietly ended after being reallocated in a matter of days. Just 1 week after starting the investigation, Detective Sullivan, who was initially in charge of it, was moved to a police outpost in South Boston. One enigmatic allusion to the Worthington case can be found in his personal notebook, which was found among his belongings after his death in 1901. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Some questions once asked continue to echo long after we cease listening for answers. The statement made by Nathaniel Cabot, a medical student who had witnessed Worthington's last demonstration, is not included in the official record. In 1962, this statement, which had been sealed by court order until 1924, was found in private documents given to Harvard University. During the demonstration, the subject, Mrs. Eleanor Bidwell, a middle-aged woman, started speaking in what Cabot described as a voice entirely foreign to her own. According to Cabot, the transformation was unlike anything I had previously witnessed in demonstrations of hypnosis. Mrs. Bidwell's voice changed completely, taking on a quality I can only describe as layered, as though multiple voices were speaking in perfect unison. What was more unsettling was the content of her speech. She started describing medical procedures using terminology that I recognized as being far beyond current knowledge as a medical student. Cabot claims that Mrs. Bidwell, while hypnotized, gave a detailed account of a number of medical treatments that would not be implemented for decades. Even more unsettling was the fact that she named a number of attendees and related intimate details about their lives that she could not have known. When Mrs. Bidwell abruptly grabbed Worthington's arm and uttered a word that made his face go completely pale, the protest came to a stop. Cabot's statement ends with a startling revelation. As Mrs. Bidwell was being revived from her trance, I noticed something that I believe no one else observed. For just a moment, Dr. Worthington's eyes appeared to change, the pupils expanding until they nearly consumed the iris, giving him a look of someone no longer entirely present. When he turned to address the audience moments later, his manner of speech had subtly altered, his usual Boston accent faintly overlaid with something I could not identify. Following the incident, Mrs. Bidwell herself disappeared from public life. Within a month, her husband, a well-known banker, relocated their family to Europe, claiming that his wife's fragile health was the cause. A distinct image is painted by correspondence discovered in 1951 between Mr. Bidwell and his brother. He penned, "Eleanor is not herself. She speaks of things she cannot know, recounts events she never witnessed. I fear what entered her that night has not departed." In a subsequent letter from June 1879, Bidwell wrote, "The physicians here in Zurich are baffled. Her condition defies classification. Physically, she appears in perfect health, yet she seems increasingly detached from her surroundings. She speaks of observing from multiple perspectives and claims to see through many eyes simultaneously. Most disturbing are the moments when she looks at me with an expression of complete unfamiliarity, as though regarding me through the eyes of a stranger." When Worthington's work was compared to other records from the same era, its strangeness took on an even more sinister tone. Within 6 months of his disappearance, 3 of his usual patients passed away, all for reasons that were hard for the medical examiners of the time to categorize. All of them were discovered in apparent terror, with their eyes wide open, their fingers twisted, and their mouths frozen in looks of deep horror, but none of them had any evidence of violence or disease. On March 3, 1879, his manservant discovered the first, Jonathan Prescott, a businessman who had sought Worthington's advice on insomnia. The examining physician stated that the condition of the body suggests extreme terror immediately preceding death. Victoria Whitmore, II, passed away on April 17th, while alone in her garden. Although the official cause of death was listed as cardiac failure, the third, George Sullivan, who had nothing to do with Detective Sullivan, was found in his study on July 29th. Her maid claimed to have heard a scream followed by silence and discovered her employer rigid with an expression of such horror that I could scarcely bear to look upon her face. According to his family, he had grown more paranoid in the weeks leading up to his passing, saying he felt observed at all times and covered all of his home's reflective surfaces. Dr. Worthington's treatment and an odd symbol, discovered scratched or sketched close to each body as a spiral with 9 points extending outward, were the only things that connected these tragedies. It wasn't until the furniture was relocated during the 1914 remodeling of the building where Worthington had practiced that it was discovered that the same symbol was inscribed into his desk. Private correspondence between medical examiners involved in these cases reveals their confusion and concern. But the Boston Medical Journal of 1880 published a brief article describing the unusual cluster of deaths among Worthington's former patients and attributing it to nervous constitutions further weakened by the stime. Unconventional treatments administered by the missing physician. As Dr. Harold Phillips stated in a letter to a colleague, "I confess I have never seen such expressions on the faces of the deceased. It is as though they witnessed something so contrary to natural law that their minds could not accommodate the perception." Another troubling event occurred in the summer of 1879. Worthington's assistant for 2 years, Thomas Richardson, was committed to the McLean Asylum in Somerville. Records show that he was discovered wandering the common at dawn, drenched despite the lack of rain, and repeatedly stating, "He opened the door. He didn't know what waited on the other side." Richardson never regained his sanity and passed away in the asylum in 1881, leaving behind a journal full of writings that asylum doctors referred to as the deranged ramblings of a broken mind. McLean's admission records detail Richardson's condition upon arrival. Patient exhibits extreme agitation, alternating with periods of catatonia. During lucid intervals, he speaks coherently, but makes claims of a fantastical nature, insisting that Dr. Worthington discovered how to allow other entities to observe through human consciousness. Patient becomes especially distressed when viewing his own reflection or when required to sleep, claiming that they reach through dreams when the conscious mind relaxes its guard. The majority of the language in this journal, which is kept in the Massachusetts Mental Health Center's archives, is unintelligible, yet other portions are glaringly obvious. The most unsettling is Richardson's assertion that he isn't gone, he's here, watching through eyes that once belonged to others. In September 1879, an especially insightful entry states, "I understand now what happened that night at Parker Hall. The subject wasn't channeling knowledge from elsewhere. She was being observed through. The barrier between observer and observed became permeable in both directions. And in that moment of reciprocal observation, something recognized the opportunity." Worthington had unwittingly created a doorway that swings both ways. Richardson describes entities that wait in the gaps between thoughts, and how the doctor believed he was reaching into their world, never understanding they were reaching into ours. Without Harvard University professor James Holcroft, the Worthington disappearance probe could have been forgotten. While investigating the early uses of psychology in America in 1922, Holcroft developed a fascination for the Worthington case. As he discovered links between Worthington's work and a string of peculiar occurrences in Boston's history, his original scholarly interest quickly evolved into something more pressing. Holcroft's growing fixation with the case is documented in his research notes, which are kept in the special collections of Harvard's Widener Library. His writing is more intense and personal as the months go by, although the early entries retain a scholastic tone. He said in October 1923, "I am now convinced that Worthington's disappearance was neither death nor voluntary departure in the conventional sense. The evidence suggests a transformation or transition that current scientific paradigms cannot accommodate." Holcroft's study was never made public. He abruptly left his job in 1924 and moved to a secluded home in western Massachusetts. The only explanation he gave his colleagues was a brief note that some knowledge is too dangerous to pursue. Nevertheless, Holcroft carried on his inquiry in secret, communicating with people in America and Europe who had come across cases identical to his. These letters, which were found after Holcroft's death in 1943, show a network of academics who were monitoring what they called boundary violations occurrences, in which Worthington and others had purportedly had contact with something that was not normally perceived. Among Holcroft's correspondents were academics, doctors, and, oddly, a number of priests from different denominations. One letter, from Father Thomas Marin, a Jesuit priest stationed in Rome, references ancient texts describing those who observe our world through borrowed consciousness, and warns that what we perceive as individual awareness may be more permeable than modern science acknowledges. Marin advised Holcroft to proceed with extreme caution, as attention invited is not easily discouraged. One letter from a Professor Weber at Heidelberg University mentions similar cases in Germany and Austria. noting that in each instance, the practitioner believed themselves to be the explorer only to become the doorway. Weber warned Holcroft to approach this research with extreme caution, as his own investigation had led to unwanted attention from forces I cannot adequately describe. Weber's letter continues. I have identified 7 cases between 1,850 and 1,915 that follow the pattern you describe. In each, the practitioner developed methods to induce unusual states of consciousness, believing they were expanding human perception. In each, there followed a period of increasingly erratic behavior, culminating in either disappearance or some form of mental collapse. Most significantly, in 5 of these cases, subjects or associates reported similar phenomena: the sensation of being observed, knowledge they could not explain, and in 3 instances, complete personality transformations that witnesses described as becoming someone else entirely. Holcroft had amassed a remarkable collection of Worthington and related case materials by 1925. Transcripts of hypnotic sessions, patient medical data, and many first-hand witness statements were all included in this collection. Holcroft had seen a pattern, according to his own journal. While their victims displayed personality changes and information they couldn't possibly have, practitioners who tried to employ hypnosis to reach deeper realms of consciousness frequently vanished or experienced mental breakdown. In a 1925 journal entry, Holcroft wrote, "The consistency across cases, separated by time, geography, and cultural context, suggests a phenomenon independent of suggestion or shared delusion. These practitioners were unknowingly engaged in the same fundamental process, weakening the boundaries of individual consciousness and inadvertently creating channels through which something else could observe or influence our world." A fragmentary transcript of an interview with Catherine Walsh, the Bidwell family's housekeeper, is the most interesting item in Holcroft's collection. Following Worthington's last demonstration, Mrs. Bidwell changed in ways I cannot properly explain. Walsh claimed that Mrs. Bidwell occasionally spoke in her sleep in what sounded like several voices simultaneously, and that on several occasions she entered rooms to find Mrs. Bidwell staring blankly at walls and conversing in whispers with empty space. Walsh recalled a particularly disturbing event. It was perhaps a week after they had decided to leave for Europe. I entered Mrs. Bidwell's sitting room with tea and found her standing perfectly still, facing the corner. As I approached, I heard her speaking softly, not in her own voice, but in one that reminded me of Dr. Worthington, though somehow altered. She was saying, "The transition becomes easier with practice. Soon this vessel will be inadequate, and another must be prepared." When I made a noise to announce my presence, she turned with a look of such emptiness that I nearly dropped the tray. For just a moment, her eyes seemed to contain nothing at all, just darkness that somehow looked back at me. Except for one detail supported by other sources, Walsh's account could be written off as superstition. She stated that in the weeks after the demonstration, guests to the Bidwell home frequently left feeling confused and disoriented, with some later reporting memory lapses or persistent feelings of being watched. Patient reports recurring dream in which a figure resembling Dr. Worthington, whom patient had met at social gatherings, stands observing her from increasingly short distances. In each dream, the figure's eyes are described as black and endless. Patient reports waking with the unshakable conviction that something has looked through her during sleep. Dr. Frederick Jameson, who treated one of the 3 frequent visitors to the home, reported that the patients were experiencing sudden onset insomnia and persistent nightmares, featuring the same figure. A tall man with eyes like empty doorways. Holcroft's investigation took an unsettling turn in April 1926. Emily Worthington, the doctor's niece and only living relative, was living in a Salem nursing facility. He had found her. Emily consented to speak with Holcroft and tell him about her uncle's efforts. Holcroft's notes from this meeting indicate that Emily gave him a key to a Boston storage facility where her uncle had stored other documents and research materials. Additionally, Emily disclosed family history that was not available to the public. After her uncle returned from Europe in 1877, she explained how he had changed. She said, "He was different. To Holcroft. Before, he had been interested in mesmerism for its therapeutic potential. After Paris, he became obsessed with what he called the observer effect in consciousness. He told my father that he had glimpsed something during a demonstration at Salpêtrière, something that made him question whether human awareness was truly individual or part of some larger perceptual field. Only a portion of what Holcroft discovered in that storage facility is documented. After this, his journal entries become more and more erratic, with references to watching the watchers and circles within circles. He mentions finding the original source of Worthington's methods, which was a manuscript the doctor had acquired from an unidentified antiquity collector who had obtained it during Egyptian excavations, rather than Vienna or Paris. According to Holcroft, this document, which was written in several hands across centuries, allegedly included methods for accomplishing reversal of the observational current, that is, ways to reverse the direction of awareness back upon whatever might be observing human consciousness from neighboring realms. Holcroft's assessment was that Worthington had been trying to use these methods in his last demonstrations. In late April 1926, a fire destroyed the storage unit and everything inside. Holcroft's journal entry is telling, "I understand now why the investigation was abandoned, why records were sealed, why families relocated. They glimpsed what I have seen. They recognized that some knowledge threatens not just our understanding of reality, but reality's integrity itself. There are boundaries of perception that evolve for our protection. Worthington's error was believing those boundaries limited us, never considering they might be protecting us." The official report described the incident as an accident caused by faulty wiring, but Holcroft's journal suggests he purposefully set the fire. Holcroft became more and more paranoid after this experience. In October 1926, his housekeeper, Martha Collins, made a statement to local police, expressing concern about Holcroft's mental state. He transformed his rural home into what visitors called a fortress against invisible invaders. Mirrors were removed or turned toward walls. Windows were covered with intricate symbol patterns. And Holcroft refused to sleep for more than 2 hours at a time because he believed that something was trying to reach him through his dreams. She told how she discovered him talking to empty seats, as if he were having a meeting with people who couldn't see them. Additionally, she stated that the professor now maintains journals in handwriting that doesn't match his own, containing information about people and places he's never visited. In November 1926, Holcroft concluded his investigation. Holcroft's caretaker claims that an older woman who showed there without an appointment or introduction was a visitor. They spent several hours in private conversation. Holcroft only kept one closed box of paperwork after she left, burning most of his research materials in the fireplace. When Collins asked Holcroft about the visitor, he reportedly said in a cryptic way, "She came to warn me that my research had been noticed, not by colleagues or authorities, but by those who watch from adjacent spaces." When Collins asked Holcroft to clarify, Holcroft reportedly said, "We believe we are the observers of reality, but we are also the observed. And sometimes the attention we attract is dangerous." 3 days later, Holcroft was discovered unconscious in his study after suffering what doctors determined to be a massive stroke. On the 3rd of December 1926, precisely 48 years after Worthington initially made public his mesmerism experiments, he passed away without ever regaining consciousness. Despite presenting symptoms consistent with cerebral hemorrhage, the patient exhibits anomalous neurological responses, according to the attending physician, Dr. Robert Wilson, who made the following unusual observations about Holcroft's condition in his medical report. On 2 occasions, the patient spoke briefly, despite being otherwise unresponsive, each time saying only, "They're watching through me now." Most notably, even while unconscious, the patient's eyes tracked movement in the room, as though fully aware of surroundings. Holcroft's executor finally opened the locked box. The manuscript itself offers the most thorough account of Worthington's work and its effects. It included a manuscript titled The Worthington Protocol, a warning, a number of photographs, newspaper clippings, and a sealed envelope addressed to any who would follow this path. When the envelope was opened during Holcroft's estate inventory, It revealed only one sheet of paper with the words, "What you believe you are discovering is actually discovering you." Holcroft concluded that Worthington was unintentionally opening the way for something else to influence both practitioner and subject. Worthington thought he was assisting patients in accessing deeper parts of their own minds, but Holcroft said he had developed a method of hypnosis that effectively weakened what he called the barrier between conscious perception and underlying reality. The draft starts off with a stark caution. This document contains information that represents a potential hazard to those who study it too closely. I have compiled this record not to encourage further investigation, but to serve as a warning to those who might inadvertently retrace Worthington's steps. Some knowledge is dangerous, not because of what we might do with it, but because of the attention it attracts. The evolution of Worthington's experiments, from therapeutic uses to more esoteric investigations, was detailed in Holcroft's manuscript. Worthington was apparently trying to induce a consensus trance, a collective hallucination state that might allegedly disclose objective facts about reality beyond normal perception by hypnotizing several people at once during his last sessions. Holcroft's study revealed that Worthington had proposed the idea that individual consciousness was merely a localized eddy in a larger current of awareness, and that the feeling of one's own identity was a necessary illusion that could be momentarily put aside by using certain trance techniques. Worthington thought he might access this broader consciousness and possibly speak with other intelligences that might exist within it by putting many people into a shared trance state. Even though it's still unclear what transpired during that last demonstration, Holcroft's study indicates that something unexpected happened, a sort of reversed effect, where whatever Worthington was trying to watch started observing him and his subjects. A number of participants described a sudden cold, as well as the unsettling feeling of being regarded by something without compassion or comprehension. According to Holcroft, based on witness accounts and subsequent events, I believe that Worthington's demonstration created what might be termed a perceptual bridge, a temporary connection between our normal, conscious reality and something else. This connection was not, as Worthington believed, under his control. Rather than allowing his subjects to perceive other realms, it allowed something from those realms to perceive and perhaps influence our own. Holcroft's finding that many of the people who attended Worthington's demonstrations or received his treatments had similar symptoms in the years that followed: persistent insomnia, a sense of being watched, unexpected intuitive knowledge they couldn't explain, and in a number of cases, a total personality change that friends and family couldn't explain may be the most unsettling. A former patient of Worthington's, known only as Mr. P, apparently started speaking Mandarin fluently in one instance, recorded by Holcroft, despite having no prior knowledge of the language. A woman who had been present at the last demonstration later developed what she called memories that aren't mine, detailed memories of places she had never been to and people she had never met. When asked about this ability, he said he had borrowed it from someone else. Holcroft's gloomy conclusion at the end of the manuscript: Dr. Worthington did not disappear in the conventional sense. I believe he remains precisely where he was, but now views our world from the other side of a barrier he should never have breached. A postscript that appears to have been written shortly before Holcroft's "I fear my research has attracted the same attention that found Worthington. I experience moments of discontinuity, periods where I seem to observe myself from outside, dreams where I am both observer and observed. Most disturbing are the thoughts that arise unbidden, in voices not my own." If you are reading this and have pursued similar questions, be warned. What you seek is also seeking you. An ambitious researcher pushing the bounds of safety, meeting an uncertain fate, and leaving only questions and warnings behind may seem like the end of the story. However, an epilogue implies that Worthington's work's effects persisted long after he vanished. A patient named William Porter was brought to Butler Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island in 1938. According to hospital records, Porter was elderly, well-dressed, articulate, but suffering from delusions of identity. Porter was obviously too young to have claimed to be Elijah Worthington. At first, hospital staff were unable to confirm the comprehensive details he offered about Worthington's life and career. According to admission notes, Porter was discovered wandering around Brown University, confused and disoriented, like a coat one outgrows. When asked his name, he first gave a number of different names before deciding on William Porter, but he told his attending physician that this was merely the most recent name I've borrowed. He claimed to have been moving from vessel to vessel since 1879, inhabiting different bodies for varying periods of time before moving on when the host begins to resist. Porter reportedly smiled when shown a photograph of Worthington from 1878, saying, "A useful face, but worn out." Dr. Harold Chambers, Porter's attending physician, was so interested in Worthington's work that he finally contacted historical institutions in Boston to authenticate information that had not been made public. A series of interviews with Porter over several months are documented in Chambers' notes, which are kept in the archives of Butler Hospital. Porter explained in these meetings what he referred to as the process of transition, which is purported to be what transpired with Worthington following his abduction. His assertions that he had worn many faces in the years that had passed were particularly unsettling, as he talked of learning to inhabit and how consciousness is not bound to a single vessel. According to one transcript, Worthington believed he was expanding human consciousness, allowing it to perceive beyond its natural limitations. What he failed to understand was that perception is bidirectional. In creating a method to extend awareness, he inadvertently created a channel through which something else could extend into our realm of perception. The entity you call Worthington ceased to exist on February 17, 1879. What remained was a vessel through which I and others like me could experience your world directly. Porter allegedly showed knowledge of medical treatments that had not yet been created, detailing in detail surgical techniques that would not be used until the 1950 seconds, in response to Chambers' doubts about the veracity of such statements. Porter's delusions could be written off as the result of mental illness, but there is one disturbing fact. Porter's knowledge of historical events between 1879 and 1938 contained significant gaps, as though he had only been intermittently present or aware during those years. When asked how he possessed such knowledge, Porter responded, "Time is a constraint of physical vessels. Consciousness, when liberated from individual identity, perceives across what you experience as temporal boundaries." He was only able to give evasive answers when asked about some significant occurrences, such as the Great War. He could, however, go into great detail about obscure medical techniques that were invented during times when he claimed to have been a doctor or researcher. The patient grinned and responded, "Old habits from previous vessels occasionally surface. The integration is never perfect." In response to Chambers' comment regarding the patient's subtle shift in manner of speech, vocabulary, and accent during our sessions, which occasionally occurred mid-conversation, Porter was moved to a private care facility that was financed by an unknown donor after spending 6 months at Butler Hospital. His post-transfer medical records have never been found. Although no body was ever buried in a New England cemetery bearing that name, the final recorded reference to William Porter is found on a death certificate from 1942. Dr. Chambers's private correspondence contains an interesting footnote to Porter's case. In a letter to a colleague dated 1945, 3 years after Porter's supposed death, Chambers wrote, "I encountered a strange individual at the medical conference in Chicago last month. Though I had never met this person, he addressed me by name and inquired about my interesting patient from 1938. When I expressed confusion, he smiled in a manner that struck me as eerily familiar and said, 'Vessels change, doctor, but the observer remains.' Before I could respond, he disappeared into the crowd." I cannot shake the unsettling feeling that I was speaking with Porter, or whatever Porter claimed to be, in a new vessel. Workers found a sealed compartment in the basement of an ancient brownstone on Marlborough Street in Boston's Back Bay in 1965. According to records, the building had originally belonged to a family who had attended Worthington's demonstrations. There were hundreds of diaries in this room, all written in the same hand, even though the dates ranged from 1879 to 1963. Before city officials could inspect the journals, representatives of a private historical society took them away, and it is unclear where they are now. Michael Donovan, one of the employees, who happens to have the same name as the policeman who initially looked into Worthington's disappearance, spoke to the Boston Globe about the finding. Donovan's statement was kept in the Globe's archives, but the newspaper refused to print the story because it was deemed too dramatic, perfectly preserved, as though sealed for decades. He said, "The room's walls were covered in the same circular pattern that was mentioned in earlier accounts of Worthington's study." One employee who saw the journals before they were taken out said they contained the same story told over and over, but from different perspectives. He remembered a passage that said, "The transfer becomes easier with practice. The new host resists briefly, then accommodates. I retain what I need from each vessel, while acquiring what is useful from the next. Worthington would be proud of how I've refined his methods." Donovan also said he saw photographs taken over decades, all of which featured different people, but all had the same distinctive pose and expression. His assertion that multiple pages included personal information about him and the other employees' information they had never disclosed to anybody associated with the building was the most unsettling. Donovan reportedly quit his job and left Boston shortly after he made his statement. There was no success in tracking him down for follow-up interviews. When an elderly woman named Margaret Sheldon contacted the Massachusetts Historical Society in 1968 and claimed to have Dr. Worthington's belongings, it was the last confirmed link to the Worthington case. Sheldon introduced herself as Eleanor Bidwell's great-granddaughter and brought a wooden box filled with various relics, such as a journal, a series of miniature brass instruments of unclear use, and a pocket watch. Records of the society show that Sheldon seemed quite keen to give up these objects and would not stay while they were catalogued. She gave a written statement stating that these objects had been passed down. The notebook seems to represent Worthington's chronicle of his last experiments, despite being partially illegible and destroyed by water. The final entry, dated February 16, 1879, the day before his disappearance, simply states, "I have been naive. They have been watching through me as I watched through others." The door opens both ways. Subsequent entries become more and more cryptic, mentioning reciprocal observation and thinning barriers. One of the brass instruments was a contraption that looked like a miniature kaleidoscope with peculiar alterations. As an ocular harmonizer, according to notes attached, it was intended to align the visual cortex with perceptual frequencies normally beyond human awareness. According to society records, a researcher who tested the device in 1969 reported experiencing sudden vertigo and the distinct impression of being observed from multiple angles simultaneously. The device was then placed in climate-controlled storage with a warning not to be handled directly. Sheldon asked that these objects be sealed and kept out of the public eye for a century. In a letter accompanying her donation, she explained, "These belongings carry an influence that persists beyond their physical form." She added, "My grandmother spoke of this influence until her death," warning that those who examine Worthington's methods too closely risk attracting attention from what she would only call the observers. The letter continues, "For 4 generations, our family has lived with the consequences of what happened that night in 1879. My grandmother was never truly herself again. My mother spoke of watching her grandmother carry on conversations with empty rooms, sometimes in voices not her own. I myself have experienced dreams where I seem to observe my own body from outside, and worse, dreams where I feel observed by something that watches from behind my own eyes." Sheldon's final paragraph contains a warning: do not attempt to replicate Worthington's work. The boundaries he breached remain weakened. Those who attracted his attention then continue to observe now, waiting for new doorways to open. Some forms of knowledge are dangerous, not because of what we might do with them, but because of what they allow to reach through to us. Sheldon vanished from the public record after her donation. Current occupants claim to be unaware of her, and attempts to reach her at the location she gave were unsuccessful. There was no death certificate or any proof of Margaret Sheldon's existence found in the city archives. which begs the question of whether the name was a fictitious one chosen to disassociate herself from the Bidwell connection. Officially, the Worthington case is still open. Although no body was ever found, the disappearance is noted as a probable death in Boston police records. Perhaps because of the unsettling trend, Holcroft noticed those who examined Worthington's methods too deeply frequently stopped their studies quickly. Citing personal reasons or unexpected shifts in academic focus, academic interest in his work has been low. Research on the Worthington case at institutions in the Boston area has been shelved at a rate significantly higher than the average for historical research projects, which is an odd statistical anomaly. 7 graduate students started working on their theses on early hypnotic research in New England between 1950 and 1965, with a particular emphasis on Worthington. Within months, all 7 stopped their research. 3 completely quit their academic jobs, and 1 was admitted to the hospital for a short time due to acute paranoid episodes characterized by the persistent sensation of being watched. What actually transpired on that February evening in 1879 with Dr. Elijah Worthington? Did he somehow become a victim of his own experimental practices, as some evidence indicates? Was there something he learned about the nature of consciousness that was too risky to explore further? Or does Holcroft's study support the more unsettling theory that Worthington let something through that still has a subtle, undetectable impact on our reality because he opened a door he couldn't close? The official documentation is lacking, the witness stories are conflicting, and there is little tangible evidence. All that is left are pieces, journal entries, letters, medical documents, and oral histories that, taken together, imply a story that is very different from what is generally accepted. A story in which consciousness is portrayed as something more transparent and susceptible to outside influences rather than the fixed, individual phenomena we typically think of it as. The most logical explanation was provided by Dr. Richard Merrill, a neuroscientist at MIT who briefly examined the Worthington materials in 1975 before abruptly shifting the focus of his research. Worthington probably discovered aspects of suggestibility and consciousness that he himself didn't fully understand. The subsequent events, the disappearance, the patient deaths, the stories of personality changes probably represent a complex interaction between suggestion, expectation, and the power of narrative to shape perception. We see what we expect to see, especially when primed by compelling stories. Furthermore, it's unclear if he found anything in those documents that completely altered his viewpoint, given his abrupt decision to stop the investigation and move to a distant part of Vermont. The case's implication that consciousness may not be the fixed individual phenomenon we believe it to be is arguably its most troubling feature. Regardless of the final result, Worthington's tests pose difficult queries on the nature of perception and identity, issues that are still pertinent in today's debates over psychology and consciousness. After cycling through several businesses throughout the decades, none of which lasted long, Worthington's final show is now held in an empty building. Locals complain about odd cold patches, a lingering sense of being watched, and trouble thinking clearly in some places. Despite logical explanation, some stories continue to exist even though they are probably only urban legends or suggestions. In the 1920 seconds, the Parker Memorial Hall building was transformed into a store, and in the 1950 seconds, it was turned into apartments. Its tenant turnover rate has been abnormally high, according to city statistics, and businesses have failed at a rate that is almost twice as high as that of comparable buildings in the region. The structure was set to undergo renovations in 1978. Precisely 100 years after Worthington's initial demonstration. Employees reported multiple electrical issues and inexplicable equipment failures. More oddly, 3 employees quit after expressing confusion and a sense of someone looking over my shoulder constantly. Tracing the ownership of properties related to Worthington's work reveals an intriguing pattern for anyone interested in historical study. Many passed hands, often, and owners frequently left abruptly after reporting changes in perspective or unsettling revelations. A number of former residents sought psychiatric treatment for persistent delusions of being inhabited or influenced by external consciousness. In her private papers, now in the medical archives of Boston University, Elizabeth Chan, a psychiatrist who worked in Boston from 1957 to 1989, recorded a number of such cases. She observed that these odd presentations were geographically concentrated around particular Back Bay and Beacon Hill locales, which were associated with Worthington's practice and demonstrations. Despite being cautious to steer clear of supernatural explanations, Dr. Chan noted that these cases have a common symptomatology that defies standard psychiatric classification, specifically the consistent report of experiencing thoughts that patients describe as not my own, combined with the sensation of being observed from within. The Massachusetts General Hospital archives contain the final known link to the case. A patient with symptoms resembling those of Worthington's cases was admitted in 1967. Despite having no prior information or interest in the case, this patient, whose name is being kept confidential, reportedly spoke during hypnotherapy in a voice that attending physicians described as entirely unlike their natural speech, disclosing specifics regarding Worthington's last display. Dr. Samuel Harrison, the attending physician, took copious notes during these sessions. In one entry, he wrote, "Patient continues to produce information about the Worthington case that proves factually accurate when verified against historical records. Despite having no academic background or apparent interest in 19th century medical history, most concerning is the patient's claim that they are not speaking from research, but from direct observation. According to session transcripts, the patient described how the barrier was weakened that night, allowing passage in both directions. When asked to clarify, they replied, Worthington believed himself the observer, never realizing he was being observed. He created a method of influence that worked in reverse. What enters never truly leaves. It merely waits, watching through borrowed eyes, learning our world one mind at a time." In a particularly disturbing session, the patient reportedly addressed Dr. Harrison by his childhood nickname, known only to family members, and referenced private events from Harrison's life that the patient could not possibly have known. "I observe through many eyes, doctor. Sometimes, when the vessel is receptive, I observe through yours." The patient responded with a smile when Harrison asked about this information. After 2 weeks, the patient was discharged, having recovered and lost all recollection of these statements. Following his resignation, the attending physician destroyed his research notes and left Boston for good. Harrison moved to a remote hamlet in Western Canada, apparently changing his name and avoiding further contact with old colleagues. His final correspondence with the hospital was a brief letter that simply said, "Some doors should remain closed. Some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve." In 1975, a former nurse who had worked with him on the Worthington case made an unsuccessful attempt to get in touch with him. One postcard, she said, had been sent to her with no return address and the words, "They notice those who notice them. Please discontinue your inquiries for your own safety." This episode might be best left as a little-known historical anecdote, a warning about the perils of pushing the frontiers of accepted science. However, one more feature raises the possibility that Worthington's work's effects are not limited to the past. 9 people in New England have claimed to be Elijah Worthington, reincarnated or returned between 1879 and the present. Each had insights into his work that historians are unable to explain. They all spoke of comparable experiences of seeing the world from various angles, and they all said the same unnerving thing in response to Worthington's photograph. A temporary vessel, nothing more. The most recent instance of this was in 1962, when Dr. Marcus Whitman, a visiting professor at Boston College, abruptly stopped in the middle of a sentence, looked confused, and then resumed speaking in a voice that students described as completely different in tone and accent. Whitman spent the rest of the lecture discussing theories of consciousness that went well beyond the subject matter he had planned, calling himself Worthington and describing perception as a window through which observation occurs in both directions. Whitman was briefly admitted to the hospital before returning to his home institution in Chicago. Marcus Whitman experienced what his peers called a psychological break while giving a history of psychology lecture. In letters to colleagues in Boston, he denied any recollection of the event and blamed it on fatigue. But a graduate student who worked with Whitman claimed to have discovered journal entries in his office with the words, "The vessel resists, but accommodation will follow." This one has a mind well suited to the work. Through his credentials and position, the research can continue without attracting undue attention. The entries were written in an unfamiliar handwriting. Is this just a strange kind of collective hallucination? The power of suggestion? Or did individuals who studied Worthington's work too closely suffer from the effects of his trials with awareness that persisted over time? The proof is still lacking, and the answers are still elusive. Dr. Marina Vukov, a contemporary neuroscientist specializing in altered states of consciousness, offers a scientific perspective. What we're likely seeing in the Worthington case and similar historical accounts is the documentation of dissociative phenomena that science didn't yet have the vocabulary to explain. Today, we understand that identity and consciousness exist on a spectrum, with boundaries more fluid than previously believed. The sensation of being watched or inhabited likely represents dissociative episodes triggered by suggestion in psychologically vulnerable individuals. Yet even Dr. Vukov acknowledges gaps in her explanation. The consistency across cases and the specific knowledge exhibited by affected individuals remain difficult to explain within our current paradigm. While I reject supernatural interpretations, I must admit that our understanding of consciousness remains incomplete. There are aspects of these cases that suggest processes we haven't yet identified. Holcroft's last journal entry. In pursuing this research, I fear I have drawn attention. If you are reading these words, you may have done the same. As we wrap up this account, we might want to take note of this warning. Be aware of sudden insights that seem not your own, of thoughts that arise unbidden, of the peculiar sensation of being both observer and observed. These may be signs that what found Worthington has now found you. Researchers can still examine the Worthington papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society, although visitors say staff members are reluctant to take them out and impose severe time limits on their review. Inquiries concerning the water-damaged journal and brass instruments donated by Margaret Sheldon are frequently redirected, and they are not included in the public catalog. According to the Society's official stance, these objects are undergoing conservation, a procedure that seems to have persisted for more than half a century. The Worthington case is both fascinating and a warning to those who investigate the dark recesses of human consciousness. It implies that as we go into the depths of the mind, we can run into currents that are more powerful than we expect, currents that could sweep us off the coast of what we take to be reality and into waters where the line between observer and observed is dangerously hazy. Last but not least, historians, psychologists, and journalists who have studied Worthington's case in depth since its rediscovery in the middle of the 20th century have noted an odd trend. Many have extremely vivid nightmares in which they see themselves from outside views in the weeks after their studies. Some claim to have recollections of places they have never been to and to have suddenly learnt knowledge they never knew. The discontinuity moments, brief intervals during which people feel suddenly separated from themselves, as if momentarily seeing the world through new eyes, are the most unsettling. The next time you're lost in thought and momentarily detached from the outside world, ask yourself, are all the thoughts in your head really your own, or could some of them be echoes of something else? Something that was first expressed through the disastrous experiments of a Boston physician in 1878 and that still observes our world through borrowed consciousness, waiting for another door to open? Furthermore, it's possible that the act of reading this account has created a tiny window that allows for both sides of observation, because stories, like consciousness itself, foster mental connections that might be difficult to break once they are formed. It's possible that the lines separating observer and observed and knower and known are more brittle than we'd like to acknowledge. And something could be observing, learning, or waiting for a chance to break through in the voids between ideas and the instants between consciousness and action. Get a good night's sleep tonight. And maybe it's best to keep your fantasy about seeing yourself from different angles to yourself. Once drawn, some attention is difficult to deter,